Owen was just saying, like in the 80s, that somatic work was very fringe. It was like
Yeah.
what people weren't talking about, they were actually rejecting it. How
hmm
did you figure out the body was the way to healing?
Well, when I really started to develop somatic experiencing in the late 60s, in the early 70s, I was fortunate to not know because the definition of trauma as PTSD was still like 12, 13 years in the future. And so I didn't know that trauma was supposedly a brain disorder, maybe even a brain disease that could at best be managed by helping people change their negative thoughts and using different medications. And so I was really on a very different path. I'm not saying that that's all wrong, that is in some cases important. But um, but I realized that when we experience threat or danger, our body responds in very clear, specific ways, you know. So for example, if we were hit as a child, punished or even hit emotionally, our shoulders might be bracing against being hit. So the shoulders would be coming up like this. And often people have, for example, present not with flashbacks, but with chronic pain. And so a typical area of chronic pain, there are several, is in the shoulders. And so what I might have people do, and you're welcome, everybody in the group, to practice this just a little bit. So if you feel some pain in your shoulders or some tension, what do you think that tension might want to do if it actually increased? And so most people will report their shoulders go up. So I said, okay, so now do that very slowly, very, very slowly, just lifting your shoulders, contracting it just the smallest amount, and then let it go. And then just notice what happens in your body, sensations, feelings, thoughts, images, pictures, memories that come up even from a simple exercise like this. Yeah. So
I'm,
again, another example of this would be, say you just go out of your door in the morning and you see somebody's been hit by a car and they're laying on the ground and your guts go, ugh. And if you walk out and see they're really badly hurt, that twisting becomes even more yuck, because our brains are set to register threat, danger, or especially injury. In working with military people over the years, that much more trauma happened when they saw somebody being injured or killed rather than they were injured themselves. So it's again how we're programmed. So the brain stem, the primitive brain recognizes that and sends the signal to the body, whether it's shoulders like this or twisted guts. And then that when that becomes habitual, becomes chronic, it's now sending messages to the brain that says the threat is still there, the injury is still there. And in a way, that's how we work with trauma, not so much with the content, although often the content comes up, but really how our bodies have responded to threat, particularly to overwhelming threat.
Mhm.
mm, mm. Do you have anything to add there, Owen?
Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, with so often with men, we've been so disconnected that we have to go slow and get them
Yes.
connected to their bodies. And one of the things I know that you really advocate, and we certainly do, is creating a safe space so they can have these subtle experiences. Uh,
Yes.
and so,
Yes.
could you just sort of elaborate on how important safety is?
Oh my God, it's so important. Um, I can give you a little bit of my personal story of how I begin to find the sense of safety. When about 30 years ago, I had been developing somatic experiencing and it being teaching, it's been taught in many different places. So in a way, that burden was off my shoulders. And but I started to have some symptoms, some the troubling sensations, troubling symptoms, and some images that would flash there momentarily. And I realized it was time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. You know, Chiron from Greek mythology, in a more contemporary way, is about the wounded healer. And we are, we all carry our wounds. I'd rather say wounds than trauma, because I mean, again, from the Greek there, it's the same thing. But wounds, it has less of a judgment to it, and less of a diagnosis to it, you know. So so anyhow, I asked one of my students to guide me to see what was underneath these sensations, these symptoms. And one of the things two of the things in somatic experiences, we really slow things down so they can be felt. If they come too fast, we can't really feel them. We just react. So we want to, you know, be able to really slow it down. And the other thing is we don't go right into the trauma, to the core of the trauma. And there are approaches, and there are many really good approaches to healing, of course. But one of the approaches that I really don't like is where they have the person relive their traumas over and over again, something called prolonged exposure. I think that can really actually just zap the energy out of people. But anyhow, we have to slow it down, and we don't go right into the center of the trauma. So clearly some trauma was emerging in my body. And then my guide, deftly kind of led me in the direction of these other sensations that I felt, again, somewhere in my body, which were sensations, again, of goodness. Something was right. Anyhow, the memory that came up was when I was 4 or 5. My parents snuck into my bedroom, must have been at night or in the morning, early in the morning, and they laid tracks, model train tracks, underneath my bed, out into the room, and then back again underneath the bed. So when I awoke to these trains going around the track. And to say I was excited would be an understatement. I was in just joy. I jumped out of bed. I went to the transformer to control the speed. I also was able to, you know, find out how to make the horn toot. So in that moment, I didn't have the words for it, but my body knew that I was cared for, that there were people who cared for me and who loved me. And even though many traumas have occurred before that, but mostly after that, that important memory really allowed me enough relative safety to deal with some of these other really horrific events. So, by the way, this is what I write about, many other things, of course, also in the autobiography of trauma. So, my guide noticed a slight shuffling of my feet, and she gently brought my attention to it and had me slow it down. And then I had this, again, another positive memory. There was a park across the street from my house, and it was called Reservoir Oval. And I went there many times. And during the time, my family was under extreme threat. And this was, again, not safety, the opposite of safety. And my father was trying to, the district attorney, the DA, was trying to get my father to testify against this mafia don named Johnny Diaguado, Johnny Dio. And he was as violent, as mean as you can imagine. He was also featured in the Goodfellas, the movie, and the Irishman. You know, and when people wanted to really brutally attack somebody, that's who they enlisted. So the DA was trying to get, it's a long story. My father wasn't doing anything bad, but all of these coincidences, he was again made to testify against Johnny Dio. And Johnny Dio said, basically, if you testify, you find your family face down in the East River. And that was, I knew there was profound danger, but I didn't know what was happening at the time. And because my parents never talked about it and never said, this is difficult and it's going to be okay, and that we're going to take care of you. But we knew that something was wrong. We could get that from our parents' body language. But again, nothing was said about it, so we kind of had to stuff it. And I remember even one evening, the mafia would send lawyers to my father to tell him how to testify. And so I remember sneaking out of my bedroom, laying underneath a small table, a telephone table, and just straining to hear what they said. And the little snippets that I get, I realized something was seriously wrong. And it really pulled my legs out from under me, really. And so in this park, Brother Oval Park, I would climb. I first go home and have my milk and cookies, Pepperidge Farm cookies. And then I would go across the street over this big wrought iron fence and down through these bushes to a running track below. And I would run and I would breathe. And I felt my legs starting to come back. So in a way, this was an antidote for having my legs pulled out from under me. Except one time something really terrible happened. And as I climbed over the fence and started going towards the bushes, I saw a group of men all smoking cigarettes with these motorcycle hats. And I realized something was wrong. And I could feel the hair on my back and my neck just stand out. And I knew that it wouldn't work if I went back and tried to climb the fence, because they could easily grab me then. So I ran down to the bushes and somebody grabbed me. I think there were 3 or 4 men, and I was brutally beaten and raped. And working with this and working with those other memories and working with the sensations and letting them move through where they were stuck, I was really able to let that go, to let it be in the past where it belonged. So again, that's something that's I take from my own experience, but I believe, oh, there's some funny noises happening. Yeah. That and when I wrote the autobiography, I had actually at the beginning no intention of publishing it. It was really for my own excavation for the memories like what I was just talking about, and how I reacted to them, and how I inhibited my life, and how I reclaimed my life and came back into a live sense in my body. One of the reviewers of the book said that a one man's soul journey from, oh God, what was it? Maybe it's here. From searing pain to joy, from self-hatred to self-love. And in a way, that is my journey. And I really believe that we all have that capacity as we are willing to embody ourselves. It doesn't mean you have some kind of a really violent trauma like I'm describing, but we all have wounds. We've all gotten message, especially men. So I want to kind of get back to that issue. And I'm really glad that you're doing that. Actually, I was in a men's group in 1972 or something like that, 74. And it was an important experience. When I moved, I couldn't continue it, but I really need, men really need to be able to feel and to share that with others so they can communicate it. It's not just having the feeling, but then being able to articulate the feeling in words. So that's kind of the nutshell about my work and about developing somatic experiencing. As I said, this is the backstory of how I developed that from my own healing and my own knowing and my own insights and my own honoring my teachers. One of the chapter is called the four most important women of my life. And they were teachers, and also the four most important men in my life. The ones that I learned more from the women teachers was more about sensing and feeling, and of the four men, except for one, it was more about intellect. So kind of again, holding those gifts together, I think supported my development as a person and as a professional, and in developing somatic experiencing.
Well, I think you really touched on a key point. I know for me, and I think for a lot of guys, is how we take what we've trained and which is the intellect, and the way of processing, which is intellectual, and melding it with the somatic and emotional.
Yeah.
And we haven't had a model that really allows for that until you developed your model, and then we've sort of adapted it working with men. And I think that's also a key thing of, for us men, we not only need to feel it somatically and feel it emotionally, but we need to speak it. And then we need to have witnesses,
Yes,
which is
absolutely.
the antidote, the antithesis of what we didn't have when we had the trauma.
That's right. Yeah, we need to be witnessed. I wrote I think it was in an unspoken voice, that trauma is not what happens. It's not just what happens. It's not primarily what happened to us, but rather what we hold inside in the absence of that present empathetic other who was able to reflect our experience. And that triumvirate, the three really need to be held together for our growth and for our evolution.
Yeah, and I think, looking at my trauma and all these other people I've worked with, is that so often we had an experience that was too big for the space that we were in.
Yes.
And that, and what's great about what we can do with these men in these groups and other situations is that, they can have an experience, and the naturalness of men just being themselves and sort of being in that more open space allows that one man to complete his experience in a way that he never could have, when he had that experience of trauma.
Sure. That's right. I mean, all I can say is I agree.